Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question, which I'm going to flip in here for you guys. And this is due to the video I did earlier today talking about historic eating patterns of humans. And he basically asks, if eating meat is linked to heart disease and cardiovascular disease, why don't predators get heart disease from it? So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about that. Fantastic point. Fantastic point. All right. Well, few things that people need to consider. They need to consider, one, comparative biology between humans who are omnivores and true carnivores, like the obligate carnivore, the animal that has to have meat to survive. Humans is optional. Like, we could, in theory, eat only meat and survive. Might not be ideal health. Or we could eat entirely plants and still probably survive. Now, in the modern world today, you're going to have some vitamins and things if you do that, because we don't exist in the same world, so you can't survive there perfectly healthy either without supplementation if you're consuming only plants. So points to remember there, but obligate carnivores, it's definitely a difference there. There's also to factor in the difference between the meat that we eat today that's factory farmed, that most of us are consuming, is not the same type of meat humans ate historically, nor is it what the animals out in the wild are eating. It's not what lions, tigers, and bears and wolves are eating. All right, number one, true obligate carnivores, which is interesting. You'll note with obligate carnivores, there's one of the things you immediately notice difference about them is some of their digestive system and their vitamins are different from us. What do I mean? They have shorter GI tracts, much shorter GI tracts. And it is presumably that their shorter GI tract causes them to consume less cholesterol. They absorb less cholesterol. They consume it, but they defecate it out. One of the other things you'll note with an obligate carnivore is that they produce vitamin C on their own, also known as ascorbic acid. Most obligate carnivores produce their own vitamin C because there is none found in meat. That's what they eat. They're not eating broccoli. They're not eating oranges. They're not eating any of this stuff that have vitamin C in it, so they have to produce their own. All right, interestingly enough, when it comes to the whole thing with meat here, what people forget, it's not the meat itself that is linked to cardiovascular disease, and people need to remember that, and everyone needs to remember that. What has been linked to it is saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. All right, this was linked all the way back in the 70s. Now, this is controversial. Some of it is believed to be weaker than this original data suggested. This is very, very controversial now, and this has been gone back and forth a few times. But it's called the lipid hypothesis. The whole idea that came up was that a doctor named Ansel Keys did this thing called the 7-nation study, and he found a correlation between saturated fat intake and by country with cardiovascular disease in those countries. This wasn't perfect. However, what is generally agreed upon is that consuming too much dietary cholesterol and saturated fat today can be a factor in cardiovascular disease and heart attacks, basically. Heart attacks, strokes, things like that. Now, the people who want to argue with this need to understand when you look at your individual blood work, there's a large genetic component there as well. Meaning dietary cholesterol, a lot of people say, well, dietary cholesterol doesn't affect blood cholesterol. In some people it doesn't. In other people it does. And that's what you have to remember. If I recall correctly, I believe it's around, is it 25%? Approximately 1 in 4 people, their dietary cholesterol does affect their cholesterol, meaning the cholesterol they consume can elevate their LDL significantly. For most people, it's very minor, though, unless you start consuming very enormous amounts. We also get into these big debates of which type of LDL. There's more than one type of LDL. One is considered benign, one's considered negative. And it's also important to consider that excessive fructose intake, or excessive sugar intakes, basically, processed sugar. In the form of fruit, it's hard to get too much fructose in. It can be done, but it would be very, very difficult. Can also affect negative cholesterol in the form of your triglyceride levels. But it's generally believed that excessive saturated fat intake negatively affects your total cholesterol, which can predispose you to heart disease. But the dietary cholesterol portion of how much cholesterol you eat affecting it seems to be very genetic. So there's a couple different factors going on there, but it is still believed that consuming too much saturated fat, particularly when combining it with consuming a lot of sugars, processed sugars, is really a bad combination. That is kind of your recipe for heart disease, because there's arguments that both can negatively affect insulin sensitivity, can cause metabolic syndrome over time, not just negatively affect your cholesterol. And these things are also linked with cardiovascular disease. So there's a lot of different things going on there. It's still argued about tremendously. There's tremendous amounts of argument among even the top experts and dietitians and medical doctors in the world on this stuff. However, as a general practice, it is considered to be a wise idea to not consume excessive amounts of saturated fat, nor is it a wise idea to consume excessive amounts of refined sugars. Both of these things need to be moderated if your goal is to reduce the chances of cardiovascular disease. And that's in addition to exercise, meaning exercise affects these things as well. Lifting weights, doing cardio are all important. There's more to it than just avoiding saturated fat. Your physical activity is an enormous factor in cardiovascular disease, which kind of comes back to another point with predators. Predators are absorbing less dietary cholesterol, if any, and they're very physically active. They have to go catch their food. So you want some factors as to why they might not be having heart disease. It's that. Now, your other thing to consider there, and it's an interesting point to me, and it's a very valid point to me because of my own upbringing. I've told you guys before, I grew up as a hunter, right? I did a lot of hunting. And I originally lived on a grass-fed, free-range cattle ranch in Texas. Now, it's not to say that we did never put them out in feedlots and feed them out, but we did have grass-fed most of the time. Although, again, when they were butchered, they would go to sale, we would feed them out oftentimes. And it depended, you know, and as the popularity with grass-fed beef came up, we did sell more of them. My family did sell more of them later that were purely grass-fed, because certain people would pay more for that, which is an interesting point. I've also consumed our own grass-fed cows that weren't fed out. And the difference between wild game that you go hunt in the wild, even red meat, versus compared to your grass-fed free-range cattle versus cattle that have been fed out in a feedlot, the amount of fat on that meat is enormously different. And what's been noted with grass-fed beef, for example, and this would arguably be true of other red meats as well. All right, this is true of other red meats as well. When you think about the differences in fat, it's not just the amount of fat, it's the consistency of the fat. It's the type of fats there. So in theory, the heart disease impacts would be different depending upon what these animals ate. And it's kind of funny because we go back to, what do you feed them out on when you want to fatten them up? Anybody know? Again, this is stuff that's important to know. If you want to talk about food and know the health of your food and where your food comes from, these are things you should know about. And it's interesting because we're going to go somewhere with this. Corn. You fatten them up on corn. Cows, pigs, whatever. I mean, when you think about it, a pig is not a fat animal in the wild, but if you've seen a strip of bacon that you buy at the store, look at the marbling on it. Bacon can be up to 80% fat by calorie. Most wild boar probably are under 10% body fat out in the wild, ones that have been purely grazing and foraging and things like that. Very, very different animal from a domesticated pig in terms of what this stuff looks like. They feed them out on anything, but corn is one of the most commonly used grains to feed out cattle on and pigs. Interestingly enough, what do we make high fructose corn syrup from? From corn. We know that certain negative things like de novo lipogenesis, which is a conversion of glucose or sugars into fat, happens at a much higher rate in both cattle and in mice than they do in humans. So interestingly enough, all this fructose, because we make it out of corn, corn has a decent amount of fructose in there, but you'd have to consume a lot of it, but we are giving them a lot of it. We're loading them up on fructose. Even though it's not refined fructose, we're loading them full of it. Starchy carbs plus large amounts of fructose to fatten these animals up. Interestingly enough, it increases the amount of cholesterol in the animal tremendously. It changes the ratios of the fat. So yeah, an animal that's been fed out might have 5 times as much fat as wild game that's out in the wild or free-range grass-fed cattle, but per gram the fat is different. Meaning when we feed them out in a feedlot to bulk them up for slaughter, they have more saturated fat per gram of fat. So yeah, they might not only have 5 times more total fat, but the saturated fat will increase more than 5-fold because they have a different fat distribution. They also have less omega-3 fats, which is again considered to be heart protective fat. So you have an animal that tremendously increases the amount of fat on its body from feeding them out, lowers the amount of healthy fats, the fats that you want to consume, and increases the more dangerous type of fats. See the problem here? And then we talk about the meat being the problem. Well, these concerns with saturated fat, cholesterol, all of that stuff isn't present in grass-fed beef that's true free-range grass-fed that's never been fed out in a feedlot. Grass-fed bison, wild elk, wild deer, all these red meats, they don't have these problems when you go catch them or shoot them in the wild and eat them. All right, their profile is completely different. So the question I would ask the people who are sitting here talking about meat being the concern, is it really the meat that's the problem, or is it the way that the animal is raised and fed that is the problem here? Where's our correlation with heart disease? It's not necessarily the meat. Because there are plenty of people out there, even today, who get the largest portion of their meat from either really lean animals. Again, that varies even on a chicken. Chicken breast tends to be really lean, turkey breast, things like that. But there are also people who eat mostly wild game. There are people who eat only grass-fed animals. Whether it's wild game that they've shot themselves out in the wild or free-range grass-fed animals. All right, there are people, and I know plenty of people who only eat those things. So the question becomes, is the problem, the correlation really with the meat, or is it with the fat? Because the two are not the same thing. Because that is not the natural state of your meat. That is not the way that meat is found on an animal out in the wild. You go hunt down an elk and shoot an elk and you pull a steak off of an elk, that same cut off of your grain-fed, corn-fed cow, that steak might have 40 or 50 grams of fat on that cow, but it only has 4 or 5 grams off of that elk. That same amount of steak that you cut from that same part of that animal, and the one off the elk still has more omega-3 fats, less saturated fat as well. So again, the problem is not the meat, it's the fat, and that fat comes from the way that we raise these animals, what diets we're giving them, what we're putting into these animals. That's the real problem. It's not the meat, it's the diet of the animal. And I think that is a big concern here, because again, if you're concerned with total fat, saturated fat, or cholesterol, they're not comparable at all. They're so dramatically different that you might as well be looking at a completely different food source when you compare free-range, grass-fed, red meat animals versus something that's been raised in a feedlot and been stuffed full of corn and has put 200 pounds of fat on in the last 6 weeks before it was slaughtered. They're not even comparable. They're almost not even the same food source. So just food for thought there. So when you talk about a predator, your predator has all those other things going on, but what's it eating? Is it going into your feedlot? I mean, is a tiger or a wolf go into your feedlot every 3 days and pull one of your pigs or your cows out and eat it? Or is he going out and eating wild animals that are lean and on their own natural diet? Big difference there. It's not the meat. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.